For over 34 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we'll look at the military situation there. I'm Julian Rupke, and this is BILD's Situation Room. And it is our duty to begin with what has happened in the approximately 2 weeks since we last observed the situation in Ukraine. We must begin by discussing the total capture of the city of Kurakhove by the Russian troops. We have various recordings that show us how the Russians are celebrating in Kurakhove, and how they also raise their flag on the westernmost high-rises and prominently in the city center. All those propaganda recordings were actually produced around the turn of the year, indicating that they happened approximately 1 week ago. We can clearly observe how the Russian forces have successfully taken firm control over the Central Park area, efficiently managing all high-rise buildings, and they have expelled more than 95% of the city's 18,000 original residents. In the upper part, we can also quite clearly see the center of Kurakhove, where the large outdoor pool is located, which has been frequented for many years, and we even visited it ourselves last September to report directly from there. Even back then, it was deserted and abandoned, of course, but it was still under Ukrainian control. Now the footage is revealing that another town, which has 18,000 inhabitants, has fallen to the Russian army in the southeast of the battlefront. And that's precisely why it is a very significant city, because it formed the southeastern corner, so to speak, where the Russians have been advancing aggressively from both the east and the south, just as significant as before Vuhledar there. Nonetheless, the battle for Kurakhove lasted only about roughly 4 months. Russians, as we recall, advanced from the east and flanked the city from both the north and south. And now we have the situation where the entire city is under Russian control. The Ukrainian army has pulled back to Dnipropetrovsk, which is approximately 5 kilometers further to the west, and is actively attempting to continue managing the defense efforts from this location. And we'll take a closer look at the map as well to see how the situation has evolved there over time. And indeed, since just before Christmas, since the last time we reported on it. Let's first take a detailed look at the map and clearly observe how the situation stood just on the 23rd December it was. That was, as mentioned, right before our Christmas break, and we had seen that the Russians were already deep into the city center back then. We see that under this lettering Kurakhove, about 60% of this part of the city was already occupied. The footage we have just viewed originates from this section still marked in orange here, and we do know that by now, and we'll soon see it as well, if we keep the recordings running, now almost 2 weeks later, the entire city is under Russian control. Here we see it, along with brand new footage, video shots taken just this morning, which we haven't shown yet, reveal to us that the Russians have now reached the farthest western point in Kurakhove, where we have also raised their flag, and now we are only about, as we can see on the map, 1 kilometer away from Dnipropetrovsk. The footage we just saw was still, as mentioned, about 4 kilometers away from Dnipropetrovsk. Further south, there are also heavy battles, which we will now watch in a video. We've seen Uspennevka here, this central place, a very small place, but a central place because it's located at so many roads. We can look at it again. So we have numerous intersections here that meet and go in all directions. The area was taken by the Russians, and we're currently reviewing some detailed footage that shows their movement slightly north of Konstantinopolsk, which isn't marked here on the map, but right next to it as they try to advance further here. And once again, the big problem the Ukrainian army is facing, which is that although they have built massive defense structures, they don't have the manpower to occupy and defend them. Let's take a look at the detailed footage we discussed and observe here another Russian advance featuring at the forefront 2 MTLB vehicles, which are clearly visible here. Those are indeed the vehicles moving ahead, moving forward towards the west, and they're moving along these very large structures. We can see it here. These are the dragon's teeth on both sides. These forest ridges that were constructed, but also these installations here, all these trenches that were built here to actually defend these forest ridges. All. These installations were built by the Ukrainians, cost many millions of euros, but are not defended by the Ukrainian army because there are simply not enough men. We see Russian forces moving through the Dragon's Teeth being attacked by Ukrainian FPV drones, highlighting their strategy against numerical disadvantages. And on the other hand, also from artillery and mines. Here again, you can see quite well these huge installations that were set up everywhere. They were all built by the Ukrainian army and not by the Russian army, but were subsequently abandoned, and now the Russians are advancing directly through these territories, being attacked solely from a distance away. We can now see how the Russian soldiers seek cover after the first vehicles were destroyed. Here we see it again. So we already have the situation where even here, and we'll see it again shortly, a very, very large part, namely sometimes 100% of the technology used, and indeed 80%, 70–80% of the men deployed here are destroyed or killed. Nevertheless, it is still enough to keep advancing. We can now see here how one MTLB drives past the other and then also hits a mine. And both vehicles, which were now disabled here, are then attacked and completely destroyed by these FPV drones. The entire situation, however, if you wish, serves as a symbol or more broadly represents a range of things that just simply don't function effectively in Ukraine. It's not that there aren't enough weapons and ammunition, we can see that here. The Ukrainians indeed have a whole lot of shells, mines, artillery and so on, with which they are now attacking the survivors here. And we'll only show parts of that and stop right away because once again you can see that almost all the survivors from these two MTLBs and the other one that's now driving here are also killed by the Ukrainian army. But the big problem is the manpower, and it's not the manpower in the logistics units or in the air force or in the drone units, but rather the manpower in the infantry. We have just witnessed how Russia deploys its infantry units, and that is of course quite certainly also a significant threat to others. The Ukrainian soldiers should be prepared for it if they agree. You're right at the very front and exposed to the fact that it's like the entire opposing army trying to kill one, and also has numerous ways to do so. This is one of the reasons why the Ukrainian infantry is facing such significant mobilization or recruitment problems. We can observe here how the Ukrainians continue to possess cluster munitions as part of their arsenal. Cluster munitions are currently being aimed and directed at these specific areas where the surviving Russians who managed to escape from the vehicles have taken refuge. And this then leads to the creation of further significant casualties among the Russian soldiers and the infantrymen who have now been deployed in these areas. It's also quite interesting to see this once more. We can observe the footage here showing the impacts in surrounding areas. Again, so here are the Russians who are being attacked, and around here are these huge facilities. This was all constructed by the Ukrainian army, but ultimately it wasn't utilized in the manner one might expect for immediate defense. Instead, they promptly retreated and then attempted to attacking the Russians precisely while they were moving through their own defensive positions and thus also stopping them. We move a bit further north to the region of Pokrovsk, a former town with 65,000 inhabitants, which continues to be defended by Ukraine. And now we'll take a look at the map for that. The Russian army is flanking the area in the south and pushing towards the regional border, specifically towards the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. As mentioned, we see Kurakov a bit further south, and up here, Pokrovsk. And here we have the situation once again on the mighty December 23rd. So, we observed a Russian army that made attempts to advance from Shevchenko both in the direction of the north, however, and this is where it becomes really intriguing. Especially advancing further west, that means they kind of leave Pokrovsk aside and do what they've done so often. They aim to intercept and sever the 2 or 3 vital supply roads leading to Pokrovsk, essentially cutting off the logistical lifeline to the city. This strategic action is intended to isolate Pokrovsk, thereby making a direct assault on the city considerably easier and providing a clear advantage in taking control. We just saw that. In Kurakov, it worked very well for the Russian army. They are trying to recreate the scenario. As we move a bit further, let's take a closer look at the last 2 weeks and explore the differences we've seen. It's clear that they haven't made significant advances to the northern area at all, but especially towards the west. Novovasilivka was taken and another small village, and we see movement is occurring on a relatively wide front. We can see that up there, so that's 7 kilometers in width you have here. That means when we looked at the width of the front, it's actually approximately about 20 kilometers or around 15 kilometers wide. As you move towards Dnipropetrovsk, you are now only 7 kilometers away, which unfortunately can't be seen here, but that's roughly the oblast border. Here is where the next central Ukrainian oblast begins, marking another region. And we must not forget, in Dnipropetrovsk there has never been ground fighting. Indeed, there are generally or repeatedly Russian airstrikes on the region, but there haven't been any ground battles yet. And for Russia, it would of course be a major victory on one hand. After all, the region was annexed by Putin, and capturing the big city Pokrovsk is, of course, also a symbolic major success. When you say, yes, we did it now, we have conquered the entire Donetsk region, and we have seen it in the past as well. Putin does not stop where he has conquered, but he goes beyond that. The excuse is always, first and foremost, to create a buffer zone, to secure the conquered and annexed territories, so to speak. But we've seen it in Kharkiv too, with current Russian army offensives, even though the area wasn't captured. That means the Russian army would indeed have an interest in advancing into the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast and continuing to harm Ukraine here. We have a variety of images and videos from this region, and we wanted to take a look at one, particularly of this small lake located right here. The lake can even be seen. And look here, how a T-90 of the Russian army advances. It's one of, or rather, the most modern Russian battle tank that is currently being produced in series. We see here on the right, or rather we have a split screen. Here we see the lake we just saw, and we can also see the lake on this side. Once the thermal view, then the normal view, and now we see the T-90 moving at the forefront. And this is yet another sign that Russia indeed has more main battle tanks, not only old ones from the 60s, which we'll see soon, but also newer ones, which have only been built in recent years. The tank is also moving here, and we'll let it run now. And watch as the T-90 is attacked by several drones at once. There comes the first one flying towards it. You always see the black dot attacking straight from the front. And then we have more drone strikes occurring on this hopping battle tank. However, that really characterizes the nature of the entire situation quite accurately. We are here at the very front part of the line. We are right where the Russians have advanced the furthest. And they send, yes, you could say a disdain for death or contempt towards their own army and technology. They're sending their very best tanks right up to the front lines. Ukrainians, lacking both tanks and troops, are instead managing the entire situation from afar to regulate from the air without losing particularly many of their own people here. And we can see now that the hit tank is still moving. We don't exactly know if the soldiers have lost their bearings or if they still know what they're doing. In any case, we're now proceeding down into, we can clearly see a pit at the end of this dam, or perhaps an impact crater on this dam. We can observe here how the tank eventually comes to an end there, and from there cannot drive any further. We see in another shot of the same scene how the tank drives in here, and see how here too the barrel is completely bent. At the very least, it is absolutely not safe to continue firing with this T-90. Even though the Russian, it's unfortunate to say, will likely keep advancing here and will probably recover this tank wreck again and then repair it at this spot. Nevertheless, that is indeed a location, a frontline location in the town of Pokrovsk, situated within the Pokrovsk region. Let's look at another one, namely another small village that was captured a bit further north, which shows us that the Russians are not limited to this region. But let's pay attention up here. We're still 7 kilometers away from the road T0504, the main road connecting Pokrovsk with Konstantinivka, slightly further north. In this area too, the Russians are making advances in an effort to cut off this vital supply route. We're reviewing and analyzing some footage from a small town which has also been overtaken and occupied by the Russian army. Here are the recordings where we can recognize quite well. The Russian soldiers move relatively freely on the streets here after fighting for them for months. And of course, it should never be misunderstood, hundreds of Russian soldiers had already died before. To get here and take over the place, they've been fighting for it since August, as long as Ukraine has held it. Now, however, we are at the northern edge of the village of this small town, and we can see right now how directly at the village boundary marker, here we see it on the left side, the Russian drone is aimed directly at it, how the Russian flag will be mounted here in a moment, to show that we are now at the very end of the place. We have finally managed, after so many months, to capture this small village, and we are no longer 7 kilometers, but now just roughly 4 kilometers away from this essential supply route, which holds significant importance for both Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk, playing a pivotal role. And when we talk about Konstantinivka, we might as well go to this region because a neighboring town of Konstantinivka is Chasiv Yar, another place the Russian army is fighting over. Right here we have some Russian footage that vividly shows just how intensely and fiercely this particular place is being attacked at the moment. We've seen in various recordings how Russian soldiers are dying or at least being attacked. Now we obviously have to stay realistic, also see what the Russian army is doing to destroy the Ukrainian defensive positions. And now we see here what still remains of Chasiv Yar. It's truly not much left at all anymore. We have massive fighting here. The Ukrainian army is not retreating voluntarily, but has been fighting since the capture of Bakhmut. We'll see it on the map soon. Since May 2023, around Chasiv Yar, the city hasn't given up yet. And that's what it looks like when Russia bombs a city for well over a year, almost 2 years, then there's not much left. Nonetheless, we still have Ukrainian soldiers holding out here, defending the ruins. And they're now under attack from Russia with, as we'll see shortly, modern weapons. We'll see it soon on the right side. Here we see it. So these are fixed-wing kamikaze drones. Here we see them. Here they fly directly towards the houses, diving right in. These aren't cheap quadcopters, but rather fixed-wing aircraft costing around 10,000 to sometimes even 50,000 euros with several kilometers of range. And we can observe it flying with a relatively high degree of precision right into the Ukrainian hideouts, showcasing an impressive level of accuracy. Here we see more attacks, again clearly visible, so this is truly a fixed-wing aircraft. We can see it quite well here. This cross, so 2 wings, also a tail unit in the back, and right in the center the main body, where the explosive charge is also located, and we can see how each individual house is repeatedly attacked, now also from the drone's perspective by the Russians. And we can observe that these are indeed large explosives leading to some destruction there, and if you do that day after day, constantly firing at these houses, you can easily imagine the kind of hell it is for the Ukrainian defenders who are holding out there, who have found refuge in that place and need to defend these homes, streets, and the entire city for several months. These are recordings from Chasiv Yar that show us quite well the terrible conditions under which the Ukrainian defenders are holding out until the Russians possibly manage to break through at some point. Here we see the city again and how it is divided. As noted, Bakhmut has been under Russian control since 2023. And in spite of the massive Russian attacks we've encountered, we can observe here once again that the entire city area of Chasiv Yar, and we only see this, 1/3 is under Russian control, and the attacks we just saw take place in this region where the Ukrainian army holds out and strives to continue, at the very least maintain their hold over the western regions of Chasiv Yar. We will now view more footage further north of Chasiv Yar, where the Russians operated in parallel to their infantry ground interventions alongside these modern attacks, which we just saw. Namely with these loitering munition drones, how they attempt with partly outdated technology to advance north of Chasiv Yar and just do that. What we have repeatedly mentioned earlier, namely a flanking maneuver alongside the frontal attack, and distinctly different types of tanks are deployed here now than before. Not very modern T-90s, but rather much older 60-year-old T-62 tanks, along with BMP infantry fighting vehicles, all of which are being deployed here to perform an operation that flanks the city, and then, in this particular case, to bypass it from the northern side, to force the Ukrainians to retreat from the city, and we can see that in footage already targeting the abandoned vehicles. That means the actual attack and the only real stopping of this tank column had already taken place previously. We can see quite clearly here, these are modern infantry fighting vehicles, not BMP-1s, but BMP-2s at the cannon, quite recognizable, but combined with, here we can see it quite clearly based on the armor, with 60-year-old T-62 tanks that are also positioned there. And when you look at it, then yes, of course, this is a PR shot from the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. It always looks very good, as if everything is highly coordinated, as if there's absolute 100% success, which might indeed be true for a particular day, for a specific attack. But when you look at the overall situation, it's really a continual retreat because you're simply not able to kill all the attackers, meaning 100%. But you're just, like we see some days you're at 100% with the technique, other days only at 70 or 50% of the technique. Accordingly, 50% advance, reach the next forest, village or whatever to establish themselves there, and thus we have the situation which we encounter now at the beginning of the year 2025, where the Ukrainian army, at least within the confines of Ukraine, is contesting the region in the east of the country, but is slowly retreating further, and the Russian army is on the verge of entering central Ukraine and invading the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. We're staying briefly in Ukraine again, but heading south, where we see that there are naturally other confrontations as well, namely between Russian occupiers and Ukrainian defenders. Here we see some footage from the small town of Korobki. Korobki, a town located in the Kherson region, has unfortunately been under occupation since 2022. Here we also see that this place seems relatively intact, as the Russians back then, through betrayal and other events in Ukraine in February 2022, as the Russians advanced quickly here without facing Ukrainian defense, taking control of all these buildings. For instance, this high-rise here, or at least this apartment block, they could convert into their own barracks. Nevertheless, in the meantime, Ukraine is now capable, and we can see it right here with precision munitions from the West, in this case with ASM-250 precision glide bombs from France, to inflict relatively heavy damage. So we see how these buildings, identified as barracks for the Russian occupation forces, are being attacked here. We can see multiple impacts overall, and we now know that Ukraine is not only using MiG-29s to drop these bombs, as in this case, but they are also using Su-25 ground attack aircraft and probably Su-24s as well. So an entire range of former Soviet-era fighter planes has been modified in this manner, that they can effectively deliver modern Western weaponry to their intended targets. And we can observe here that the notable destruction is caused by just a single AASM-250, which happens to be a relatively light bomb used by the French army. Relatively large because they hit so precisely. In the end, we want to go to Russia again, take a look at the Kursk region, and within that region, Ukraine is still attempting to inflict substantial damage on the Russian military forces through precise and well-targeted strikes. We are looking at footage that is already a few days old from Ivanovskoye. Ivanovskoye is a city in the Kursk region under Russian control. And the Russians assert that civilians were hit in this location. However, we can observe quite clearly that it was a precision strike, with the Z up there being distinctly visible, likely targeting a command post of the 810th Unit Marine Brigade of the Russian Army. Heavy losses were reported here as the Ukrainians, according to the statements of the presidential advisor, stated that they had some good fortune recently. They had knowledge that at a specific time, Russian officers were planning to convene in a specific building and subsequently targeted this house with accurate and reliable intelligence and the proper precision weaponry. Which ones these are is not clear. It could possibly be HIMARS or ATACMS ammunition that was used. Even so, no video evidence exists yet. We can see that significant destruction was caused and occurred at the military sites or structures where there were also casualties on the Russian military side, as well as at civilian sites like some shops and some, yes, exactly, we can see here now, some shops and restaurants and civilian houses around were also damaged. Nonetheless, Ukraine continues to be in a particularly difficult and challenging situation in the Kursk region. Up until yesterday, it really seemed the Russians were advancing further from all directions. Above all, what we have changed here now, or what can also be seen well on the map now in the east of Sucha. Here we can see an area that was actually still relatively safe in the past few weeks. The major Russian offensives began from Lyubimivka and were directly focused on Malaja Lokna, this particular location. However, not much has really happened here so far, yet in recent days a significant number of North Korean and Russian troops have already been deployed here to advance from Plekovo and Giri towards Sucha. Sucha is the only town with 6,000 past residents under Ukrainian control in Russia. This entire area here has been lost over the past few weeks. Now the Russian forces are positioned only about 2 kilometers away from Sucha. There are very recent reports from Russian military bloggers that we haven't been able to verify yet, and that's why we haven't really incorporated them here yet. And these claim that a Ukrainian military offensive appears to be unfolding at present in this specific direction, particularly along the strategic road leading towards the area of the major city Kursk. Some bloggers say it's a major offensive, others say it's not that bad and we've already fended it all off. In that context, we're still waiting, but we'll maintain our focus in the coming days not only on what's happening in Ukraine, but also on what's ongoing elsewhere. Since August 6th of last year, in the areas still under Ukrainian control in the western part of the Russian region, namely Kursk in Russia.